So where we've got to work on our app now is making it so that when we hit the history button or the reset all button that we actually want things to happen. And the reset all button, this is going to be very simple. So let's just go ahead and knock this one out. If we move over to our interface controller, let's give ourselves some space to work with here. We're going to scroll down to that. So when the reset all gets tapped, basically what we're trying to do is just set everything back to 0, which means get everything out of user defaults and make sure that we update the UI to show this information. So what we're going to do is, and we're going to also want to make sure that clocked out or clocked in is equal to false. And let's just, while we're at it, let's do our update UI right there. And then we also want to, before this is where we dive into the standard defaults. So we're going to say we want our user defaults dot standard dot, and this is where we want to essentially remove everything, which one way to do that is by setting everything to nil. So we're going to say set, and we'll put nil, and then we got to add all the keys in here. So one of these is clocked in. We'll go ahead and copy and paste that there. And then we want to do this also for the clocked ins and the clocked outs. So we'll go ahead, paste those there, change this to clocked ins, change this one to clocked outs. So this should get rid of everything for us. Let's go ahead and run this, and really that's all we need. Like, we've set up everything in a nice way that we just have to, set everything. This update UI handles all the situations, and it's going to look great. So I want to show it from a couple of different angles. So for the first one, let's go ahead and clock out. Well, I guess since we're already here, let's show what it looks like when you're in currently a clocked out state. We have a total of 11 hours and 28 minutes. I'm going to hit this button. Then I'm going to change that the touch pressure is just 1, and I'm going to hit reset all. Look at that. It clocks us out and it resets everything. Now I'm going to do a different situation where I, clock in and out a few times, but I'm currently in a clocked out situation. I'm going to go to my hardware, make it a deep press, come back, change that pressure to a shallow, hit reset, and look at that, it gets rid of it as well. So in either situation, we're ready to go. I love how simple that was because of all the work that we had done previously. Like, to add a cool little feature like that, 2 seconds. One thing I'm realizing here is we're still printing out stuff there. We don't need to be printing things. So let's go ahead and remove those lines of code. Great. All right. Now the next step is we need to make it so that if someone hits history, that they can then, move on to a view controller where they can see all the different clocked in and clocked out times, how long they were for, and then a detailed page showing, this is when they clocked in, this is when they clocked out. So in order for this all to happen, there's a couple of things that we've got to do. And the first one is we got to start working with our storyboard. So this is kind of a big one here. We have a table currently in our interface controller. So the first thing is we've got this nice table, but the table has these things called table view row controllers. And basically think that as like a table view cell in the iOS world. And in order to get something to show up in there, there's not like a standard label or image view that's going to show up. We actually have to add that ourselves. So all we're going to do is we're going to go grab a label, and we're just going to drag and drop this into our table row controller. So you can see we've got that little one right there. Now with this in place, we're going to have to do a little bit of work to get everything up and connected here, because we've got to bring these things in, and you can see one with this label, it's not filling up all the appropriate space. So let's go ahead and select this and say, we want to go center and center on this. But even with that, for the width, we want this to, let's not fit it to content. Let's do it relative container and say 1, so it fills up the entire space. And then height, same thing, relative to container. We want it to take up the whole space there. But now what we've got to do is we've got to connect this all via code, and it's going to take a little bit of work here, but we can definitely handle this. So the first thing is that we need to connect an interface controller for this whole thing. Then we'll start worrying about the table and all that. So let's go ahead and first select this group here. Make sure it's the WatchKit extension, not the WatchKit app, but extension. We're going to right click and say that we want to do a new file. And with this, in this, we want to do a new Cocoa Touch class. And we want this one to be a watch kit interface controller. So we've got to move over here. We're going to do WK interface interface controller. Okay, the whole thing there. Now, as far as the name for this, I'm going to call it maybe something like detail interface controller. Up to you about what you want to call it, but I think that kind of describes what we're going on. Like, well, excuse me, this isn't the detail interface controller. We want to do this for the table one. So maybe we can just go ahead and call this history interface controller. I was one step ahead of ourselves. So we'll go ahead and create this. We want to add this to the extension. So we'll make sure that that's checked there. Now with that in place, I'm going to move it up by its friend right there. We're going to come back for this history interface controller and select this interface controller and say, guess what? You have a class of history interface controller. Now when you're done with that, make sure you hit tab or enter, because that's going to manually make sure that everything's connected up there. So that's the actual interface controller, but we actually have to move over the table view row controller. Like, that's got to be its own thing as well. And so for this one, also select this extension, but we're going to say new file here, and we're actually not going to do a Cocoa Touch class on this one. We're just going to do a regular old Swift file. And as far as the name for this goes, I think we should call this the clock in and out row controller. So I'm going to say clock in and out row controller. Okay, bring it up by its friends. And I'm going to have this import watch kit, and then we have to manually type this up. There's no sort of automatic way to get this up here. So we're going to say we want a new class called clock in and out. It's in fact the name of our Swift file that we created here, so we can just go ahead and copy paste that, save us some time. Say that this is going to inherit from NS object. Okay. And that's really everything that we need to get this set up. Like, it's really that simple. That's all we need to have there. Let's go ahead and do build. But with this WK, we've got to make sure that here in this class we import watch kit, or else we're going to get an error on that one. But with this in place now, we can go back into our storyboard here. Okay, and we're going to select our row controller right here, and we're going to bring back the side menu and specify that this inherits from a clock in and out row controller. Hit tab or enter on that, and that's going to connect everything. Now with that connected, then we can take the label that's inside of here. Let's go ahead and do our split screen. You should by default see that row controller showing up. If not, you need to set this to automatic and make sure you go to your clock in and out row controller. But all we're going to do is simply just control drag our label into here. Then we've got to pick a name for this thing. Because we only have one, I'm just going to call it label. Seems simple enough. I think that kind of gets to the point. And now we're at a place where we can move back into our history interface controller and start filling out that table view with information. Now, with this in place, I want to make sure that you sort of understand how table views work in the Apple Watch world. They're quite different to what you might have seen inside of the iOS world. They're not that much different, but I mean, the idea is still the same, that you're showing up a list of things, but there's no sort of table view, data source, and delegate, which on the one hand is really cool, but on the other one really shows you that you can't be putting a lot of information into an Apple Watch, which I don't think you would want to be, right? Like, you wouldn't want to list out 5,000 songs on an Apple Watch. Like, no one would be able to scroll through all of that. Like, that would just be crazy. So anyways, you got to be ready for that. So in order to get this to work, we have to bring over our table. And so let's go ahead and move back to our storyboard. We're going to select the table here, go to our split screen, and just do a control drag. I'm just going to simply call this the table. Then we can go back to our code here. Now, we didn't get by default some of the functions that we need in order to make this all work. For example, like the awake function, we never got that showing up or anything like that. So we're going to have to manually add those in ourselves, but it's not hard code at all. So we're going to make a new function here that we're going to call awake. We want the one with context. Okay, so we've got that function in there. That's nice. Make sure you do a super.awake here and pass in the context so we can do that. Now with this, we got to make sure we have an override because this WK interface controller already has an awake function. We're just providing our own version of that, and that's why we call that super one there. But now with this in place, this is going to give us enough to be able to fill out the table view. And basically, the way that a table view works is like this. So let's say I had a variable with, I'm just going to call it letters, okay, with some letters. And this is going to be equal to an array that's got like A, comma, B, comma, C. Let's do D. Okay, so it's got 4 letters inside of here. If you wanted to fill up the table view, well, you'd have to say, okay, I'm going to do 4 index in, and let's do 0 dot dot. Basically, you want to loop through everything that's inside of your array. So I'm going to say here letters dot count. Okay, so I've got this nice little for loop here. Then what we're going to do inside of here is get access to our row controller. So we're going to say if let row controller be equal to, and this is where we're going to say table dot, and we want row controller at a particular index. So let's throw in the index that we have. We only have 1, so it's not really going to be an issue, but we should specify that this should come out as particularly a clock in and out row controller. Okay, clock in and out row controller. There we go. So that sort of unwraps it for us. And then once we have that information and know that it's all working, well, then we can take our row controller and get to its label, which remember we created that. And then we can say on that like set text. And in this case, we would just say letters at a particular index, just like that. Okay. So this is really all it takes in order to get this up and running for this to work. And so let's go ahead and give this a run and see if we can't get this working. Okay, so we'll go ahead and run this. Well, I'm realizing we don't even have a way to get to that interface controller. That means we've got to go back and show you just one more step here. So let's bring back our side menu here. Go to our regular interface controller, and it's down here inside of this history tab that we've got to be able to get to that interface controller. So what we want to do inside of here is basically do a segue, except in the Apple Watch world it's called a push controller. So we're just going to say here push controller with a particular name. We'll fill that out in a second. As far as context, we don't need to pass anything, so just put nil there. But in order for this to work, we've got to go back to our storyboard, and we've got to give this interface controller a name. So we'll go over here. Let's give it an identifier. We'll call this history. Okay, let's make sure we copy this so that we have that. And then we're going to come back to our regular interface controller, and we're going to say that's the one that we want to move to. Okay. So let's run this one more time. Now we actually have a way to get to what it is that we're looking for. But again, we should just be seeing a table view that is showing A, B, C, D, those 4 letters that we have. All right. So we'll give the Apple Watch just a second here to load up. Come on. Anytime. We believe in you. No, my Mac's running low on power. Maybe that's why it's taking a little bit of time. I'll plug that in. Okay, so I'm going to go to my hardware. Let's do a deep press, then go back to a shallow press. I'm going to go to history, and look at that. We don't get anything showing up. So the reason for this is that we forgot to tell the table view how many rows it should be looking for. In fact, if you come down here, we've got this thing that's saying, hey, you know, it's asking for these many things, but it didn't specify that it should be able to handle this. This is because up here at this history interface controller, before we loop through and do all of this, we need to get to our table and say, okay, table, we're going to set number of rows to a particular number. And so we're going to say that this is going to be equal to however many letters that we have. So set number of rows, and this is just going to be letters.count. Okay, and then as far as the row type goes, this is going to be a string. This is another thing that we've got to dive into our interface controller for. And we're going to have to go ahead and say here that we're going to give these an identifier. So I'm going to call this in, out, row. Okay, I'm going to copy that so I have it exactly, and then specify that there. Okay, so now with this in place, let's go ahead and run this one more time. It should be giving us what we're looking for now. So wait for a second here for our app. With this plugged in power, it moves much faster. And I'm going to do my deep press here. Oh, sorry, I thought I could do the, so I can't do the hotkey press because it's going to lead it for there, but if I ever want to go shallow, I can do that. So look, all of a sudden, there we go. We have A, B, C, D showing up here inside of a table. So if we kind of just go ahead and recap what it is that we've got to do to get a table to work, you just have to say how many rows you want, and then you just manually loop through and add each of the things. So it's still kind of at the end of the day, same with the table view, that you've got to specify the rows and then the cell that should show up at each of those. It's just a little bit different in the way that you handle that. And you can see, because we're doing a for loop, you really wouldn't want to have like 1,000 letters inside of there. That could really get tricky for you. But now that we understand how this works, let's go ahead and type out everything that we need to make this work for us and our, clock in and our clock out times, essentially. So let's go ahead and make a place to store all of our clock in and clock out times. I'm going to say var clock ins is going to be equal to an array of date objects that initially is empty. And we'll do this also for our clock outs. So I'm going to go ahead and specify clock outs there. Great. Next thing that we need to be able to do is to pull these things out of user defaults. So I'm going to say if let clock outs be equal to, I guess let's start with clock ins. We've always gone to the pattern of clock ins then clock outs. User defaults dot standard dot array for the key of clocked outs. No, clocked ins is what we want. This should come through as an array of date objects. Only move forward if that's the case. And then we can simply just say self.clockins is equal to clockins, right? So the self dot is referring to the property, whereas clockins is referring to the local little constant that we have here. Let's do the same thing for clockouts. Okay, so I'm going to change this to be outs. I'll change this to be outs as well. It's an array of dates, and so then we'll say, guess what? Clockouts is equal to clockouts. Great. So that gives us all the data that we're going to need in order to fill this out. Now, when we don't need this array of letters anymore, we're essentially going to replace letters with what we have. So as far as number of rows goes, again, pick clock ins or clock outs that you want to use. So I'm going to choose clock ins here and say that let's just grab the count from that. I'm going to do a build here and see why I'm getting these warnings. Cast from string. Oh, we didn't want string here. We wanted array. Okay, that should make us much happier. Let's do a build. And let's see. There we go. Looking better. Okay, so we've said the number of things should be whatever is inside of clock ins. You could do clock outs as well. Then as far as looping, again, take the count of either one of those. I'm going to choose clock ins for that. And we still want to, be able to unwrap our row controller here and all this stuff. But here, rather than say that we want to set the text equal to, letters.index or whatever, like we want to show something nice like this, where we say like 1 hour, 4 minutes, 12 seconds, whatever that ultimately is going to end up being for us. So we can actually grab a lot of this code from our previous interface controller, right, where we had gone through and said if we're going to get like the total time that someone has gone, like I think in fact the better one here is going to be this chunk of code where we can say, you know what, we're going to divide all of these, we're going to do all these cool little if statements. So I'm going to copy all of this, then I'm going to move back to to our other view controller here, our interface controller. Caught myself slipping on that. So as far as the time interval goes here, when we're trying to figure out what it is that we're working between the two, first one is going to be the clock out date. So we're going to say clock outs, and let's get the one at the current index. And then for this, we'll do clock ins. Let's pass in the current index. Great. So that gives us a time interval. And then we've done all this awesome work here to go get whatever it is that the current time period is. And then we'll just say here for set text, pass in whatever current clocked in string is. Okay. So this is going to be everything that we need for that. Let's go ahead and do a build. I think that was just an old error that Xcode was just kind of hung up on. And we should be able to see all of our different time periods. So let's go ahead and run this. See what we get back. Once we're done with this, it's going to be really easy to show up the detail for a particular time period, but let's go ahead and wait for this. Okay, I'm going to do a deep press here, go back to shallow history, and oh, I just realized we don't have any clocked in or clocked out periods, so let's go give a couple of those. Let's do some with a couple more seconds so that we can hopefully see those. Now we'll go ahead and do our deep press, go back to shallow, history. Look at that. We've got those all showing up. So they're not particularly great. We only have 1 hour showing up where we should have definitely be seeing like the minutes and seconds. So let's go ahead and see what's going on there. Well, I found out what the issue was. It was pretty silly. Remember when we had created a new line in the previous chunk of code for that label because we wanted to be split up? Well, if you try and do a new line inside of a label that only has one line, well, you're not going to get anything else to show up. So we have to make sure we get rid of that new line right there. When you copy and paste code, you'll find sometimes it doesn't always work out as you were hoping. But let's go ahead and do our deep press again. Let's go back to shallow, and now let's get rid of this breakpoint that I had to debug and find that, and look at that. We've got, all these different time periods showing up. There's that one that I let run a little bit longer with the 23 seconds. And the way that we inserted these into user defaults made it so that, the most recent ones were at the beginning. I think that's a pretty good way to move forward. So now we just need to make it so that when someone taps on one of these, that we can move forward into the next interface controller. So in order to get that to work, what we're going to do is add one more function to this interface controller, and this is going to be called did select row at. So start typing did select row at. Okay, we've got our table did select row at, and basically what we want to do inside of here is a push controller. And one thing that's kind of interesting here is that this is just a part of a standard interface controller. Like, you don't have to implement a table view, data source, and delegate. It's just sort of there by default, which I find to be pretty interesting. But we've got to put some sort of name inside of here. As far as context, we do want to be able to pass forward something. What we want to pass forward is the clocked in and the clocked out time, because we want them to show up here. And so basically, we should just go ahead and create a little dictionary here on the fly. I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we'll just put one key to say clocked in. Okay, and we'll have that be the value of whatever clocked ins is at the selected index, which is this row index. Okay, just like that. And after we've done that, we're going to say comma. We're going to get our clocked outs, clocked out singular, and the value for that is going to be clock outs at the particular index of row index. Great. Okay, so we're passing forward that little dictionary. We still need to give a name to that interface controller, so let's bring that over here. Let's go to our interface, and we're going to give a name to this. So we'll give this the identifier. I might just call this detail. In fact, if we wanted, we could call this time detail, something like that. Whatever it is, go ahead and copy that and bring that back here. We're going to pass that into our name that we're trying to move to. Then it's just a matter of getting everything set up there. So we don't have an interface controller set up yet for this. So let's go ahead and make one of those. We're going to make sure we have the extension selected and say we want a new file. It's come from a, let's make sure we go over to watch OS here. I think this was actually the better way to handle this. If we do watchKit class, and I do WK interface controller, I'm going to call this detail interface controller. I think this will actually give us the like awaken. Yeah, look at that. Okay, so that's why we weren't getting that earlier. So with this in place, we don't need the did deactivate, and we don't need the will activate. Let's just put everything inside of our awake function here. Okay, and what we want to do here is basically show everything, but first, before we do that, let's specify that you interface controller belong to the detail interface controller. Hit tab or enter on that. And let's make sure that's all connected there. Looks good. Now something that's cool is that, you might have seen that we had warnings before. Those are all due to like interface controllers not having a proper identifier attached to them and all that jazz. But with this in place, really all we got to do now is just do a little split here. Let's give ourselves some space to work with. And we just need to bring over these two labels, right? Because these are the ones that we would update with potential information to say, oh, this is the, clock in label. This is the clock out label. So we've got to make sure the right one's connected here. So we're going to do detailed interface controller. These are both outlets. So this is our clock in label. And we also want to do it for the clock out. We'll do a control drag and say this is the clock out label. Great. So we've got those all connected. Let's go back to full screen. And we should be passing forward all the appropriate information, right? Inside of our history here, we're passing in this this little dictionary. In fact, I'm going to copy this, and then here inside of our details, I'm going to just in a comment paste that so I can remember the format of how that all works and stuff, so that when I want to pull things out of it, it's not going to be an issue. So the first thing that we got to do is grab the clocked in and the clocked out time from this context. So I'm going to specify that if let I'll call this dates be equal to the context that came through, which is of type any, and say that this should be as a dictionary where we have strings for the keys and then dates for the values. So we'll only move forward if that's the case. Then we want to get the clocked in and the clocked out. So we're going to do if let clock in be equal to, and then we'll go ahead and grab our dates. We're going to specify as a key here that we want to pass forward clocked in right there. Okay, and we'll go ahead and do a little curly bracket, and then the same thing for the clock out. We're going to say if let clock out be equal to clocked out right there. Boom. I'm going to do my capital O there. So if this is the case, then we have clock in and clock out, which are all actual date objects. They've all been properly unwrapped and all that great stuff. Now we just want them to show up, and we want to have a proper formatter to be able to display these. So we're going to say let formatter be equal to, and we're going to go grab a new date formatter, open and close parentheses there, and then we're going to say formatter dot date format. We've got to specify how this should show up. If you want to know how to do this, go to just search NS Date Formatter. There's a great website that can show you how this all works. I've found one that will look good for our situation. We want 3 capital M's, a lowercase d, lowercase h, colon, lowercase mm, and then a. This shows the months, the day, the hours, the minutes, and the AM, PM, all there. Okay, so with this in place, we just got to basically update these two labels. So I'm going to say clock in label dot set text, and I want to set this equal to the formatter dot string from a particular date. And that's when I'm going to pass in clock in. Boom, just like that. And I want to do almost the exact same thing for the clock out situation. So I'm going to change this to clock out label and have this come from the clock out date. Okay, so that's it. Let's go ahead and give this a run. This will be our final check here on our app. This should be accomplishing everything that we were looking for. So let's go ahead, build this. Here it comes, big moment of truth for us. Okay, so we have a few periods. Let's go ahead and make sure we've got enough time, 11 hours. I'm going to change to be doing a deep press. Go back to shallow. I'm going to go to my history. Ooh, look, there's some of these. Let's, tap on this one, for instance. Look at that, July 7th at 11 a.m. and July 7th at 12:24. Like, those are the differences between the two times. I can click here. Oh, just gorgeous how this is working. Love it. If you wanted to, we can say, you know what, I'm sick of showing all of these and I'm going to delete all of it. Let's go back and do a deep press here, reset all, bam, we're at a clean slate. And if we go back and want to check our history now, you'll see that we'll have nothing here. So if we do that and we go to our history, boop, nothing up there. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed creating this Apple Watch app. That was pretty fun to work with, at least it was for me. One thing that you've really got to keep in mind, and I hope that you learned here, is that when you're displaying things on an Apple Watch, you got to keep it very simple for the user. I think making this a green and then a red button is really good to help the user know what situation they're in. It doesn't have to be complicated at all. You don't want a ton of things to show up inside of a table view, so you got to be a little bit careful with that. But hopefully you enjoyed checking out the Apple Watch world. There's lots more to dive into. You can get into compilations and all that, but I wanted to give you a nice introduction to how it all works.